All right. It is Pecking Order Thursday here on Purple Daily. Phil Mackey, Judd Zulgad, and Declan Goff. Thanks to everyone who watches these shows on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/ScoreNorth, where you can click the subscribe button and get daily Vikings content in your feed. And also on the podcast front, Apple, Spotify, and ScoreNorth.com, where you can get said content right to your mobile device or whatever internet mechanism you use. Judd Zulgad, you have put together a pecking order
Yes,
of,
sir.
am I phrasing this the right way, former Vikings players that you would love to see in their prime. I don't want to see like 55-year-old Anthony Carter or anything, but
right.
in their prime in 2020 in a Vikings uniform.
Yes, and it's based on, and it is, just to be clear off the bat, very, very subjective, okay? So there's going to be debate here, and I don't know that there is a wrong answer. But it's based on transplant these players from their era in their prime into 2020 and give them today's rules.
Mm-hmm.
So you give them today's rules, which obviously have changed greatly. There's been far more a crackdown on quarterback protections, on pass interference rules, on holding. And so I was trying to think of the players who would most directly benefit from those changes.
Okay.
And the fact that it would be fun to see what they could do today.
So you could turn it around the other way. It would be fun, for instance, to see like Jack Tatum try to navigate today's NFL rules, right?
Or they have a skill set that wasn't used as much in their era and would definitely be used now. All right.
Okay.
And thanks to the people on Twitter, I put this out we're taping this on Thursday. I put this question out on Twitter on Wednesday and got some really good responses as well. So I incorporated those into my top 10 list.
All right. Well, let's fire up the appropriate music here. Let's get into the mood here for this pecking order. Yeah. Football.
The autumn wind is a revisionist.
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to start with a guy who was on my list and I bumped because I don't know that today's game would improve him a ton because this guy was good, effective, and if he had played maybe in the 60s or 70s, he makes this list, but he played in the early 2000s. Daunte Culpepper.
Yes.
Huge quarterback.
Yes.
Really good skill set. Might benefit a tick from today's rules, but I don't know, as I'm about to roll through 10 names, that he would have benefited more than the guys I'm about to give you. So he's just outside, but there's certainly a case to be made that he could fall in this top 10.
Well, if you look at, there's two different trends happening at the top of the NFL's quarterback pecking order, if you will. There are a lot of African-American quarterbacks that are like Pat Mahomes, Russell Wilson, Lamar Jackson, Deshaun Watson. This is the golden era of black quarterbacks in the NFL. And Daunte Culpepper wasn't necessarily one of the trailblazers, because when I think of trailblazers, I think like 1980s. I think Doug Williams. I think Warren Moon. I think Randall Cunningham. You can even go back before then. And so just to see Daunte in an era where, hey, some of his peers are also having opportunities and successes come to them. But it also like just the mobility of top quarterbacks, the ability to flush out of the pocket and keep plays alive. And Daunte Culpepper was always great at that. Do you think he would be better in today's era, or because he was already pretty damn good for 3 or 4 years?
That's right.
At his peak,
I don't know that for sure.
Like he took pretty good advantage of the structure of the NFL 20 years ago.
I think he's good now, but he was good for a period during that time. I also don't think today's game saves his knee, because he ran the ball in Carolina and got hit by the two guys, and his knee essentially blew up. But if he does that today, same result.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like the rules screwed him, right?
Yeah.
Because that play was, now if he's in the pocket and it was a weird, aggressive, violent play, then I would say that probably changes in 2020. I don't think that changes today. So he is just outside of my top 10.
He was also sort of Big Ben before Big Ben in a way. Like Big Ben came in the league in like 2005 or something.
Yep.
Yeah, just like this rock of not a statue because he can move, but like a guy that you needed 3 dudes to bring him down in the pocket. You see all these highlights of Big Ben with like 4 defenders trying to drag him down. He gets the throw off, and that was kind of Daunte Culpepper too. So it would be fun to bring in his prime Daunte back.
Number 10 is off the charts a little bit, and the name's going to surprise you until I explain why. And then I think at least Phil is going to agree, because I believe that he was at this practice in Mankato and saw this. And today you would use this in games. The Vikings did not use it in games back then. The 2008 acquisition of dominant at the time right defensive end Jared Allen. But I put Jared at 10 on my list, not because today's game improves him, because he, again, was really damn good. And I think basically use the rules to his advantage as much as possible. Do you remember the practice? And Kansas City had done this, and the Vikings practiced it but didn't use it. Jared Allen incorporated at tight end.
Yes.
Jared Allen had the skill set to play, and I'm not trying to say he would have played tight end and given up defensive end, but I think in today's game, goal line wise, red zone wise, there's no doubt in my mind, if you are a creative offensive coordinator, Phil Mackey and Declan Goff, Jared Allen gets plugged in at times as a tight end and catches touchdown passes.
One of the most athletically gifted defensive ends of that era, right? Like I don't think you think of Jared as a potential offensive weapon, but there were times at practice, I remember Vikings PR would come up to reporters on the sidelines when they would bring Jared Allen out for some sort of a trick play or something, and they'd say, all right, you didn't see that. You can't write about that. You didn't see that. And be like, well, there's 2,000 fans in the stands that all saw it.
I had to negotiate with Childress for us to write that because of what you just said. 2,500 people sitting in the stands, drunk in Mankato, just saw the guy play tight end, and you don't want teams to find out, so the newspaper can't write it.
And so, like, the logic there would be, wait, you're telling me if I just hop the fence, drink a couple beers, and sit in the crowd, then I can? Then I did see it?
That would be correct.
But yeah, Jared Allen playing offense.
So Jared Allen at tight end is number 10. Number 9 is I went through the list of all the veteran quarterbacks that the Vikings brought in, some good and some bad, in the 90s. And I thought to myself, which one in today's game, if you put him in right now, between the age of, let's just pick 25 to 33 or so, who would benefit the most? Who could be just great? And I came up with number 9, Warren Moon. Warren Moon in today's game, I think, would be really fun to watch. Imagine
just throwing bombs down the field.
The protections that quarterbacks get now compared to the 90s, Phil.
Yeah.
I think Warren Moon is my choice.
Yeah, Warren Moon and Dan Marino and Warren Moon at times did carve up the NFL in their eras. But imagine those guys with all the different restrictions off, not having to worry about Reggie White clubbing you upside the head or Lawrence Taylor literally ripping your leg off of your body, right? Yeah, Warren Moon would have been fun. Warren Moon, hell, was fun to watch as a Viking. I remember the first Vikings game I ever went to was a Warren Moon game in the mid-90s. So, and he wound up playing for, I think, a couple different teams after he left the Vikings. He was with the Seahawks and
Kansas City
or something.
And he played 3 years here, and I think he had one great year. But if Warren Moon is protected like quarterbacks are now, Warren Moon. Okay, so I went through the list of the Purple People Eaters and said to myself, which one in today's game would thrive? Page would for sure, I think, but Page was smaller, and so I guess my question is, would he have to gain weight? And he did win the NFL MVP in the early 70s, which at that point for a defensive lineman, unheard of completely. Mm-hmm. So I decided the representative from the Purple People Eaters that the Vikings employed for so long would be my 8th choice, Karl Eller.
Ooh.
Because get this, he was a Viking from 64 to 78. Now, as we've talked about 1,000 times before, one of the most ridiculous things probably in all of sports statistical keeping is that sacks didn't count or weren't accumulated, counted till 82.
How? And I will go back and say, the NFL has so much money. There's not there's got to be an intern somewhere in the country right now that raise their hand and say, I will watch every game in the NFL's history and tally up the sacks. Where's the archive?
The amazing thing is they did. They just don't count them.
What?
So Eller was credited as a Viking with 130 and a half sacks. They've got it. They just won't acknowledge it because it wasn't an official statistic. That's
bogus.
According to what I found, that would make him the Vikings' all-time sacks leader. He had 15 and 69, and then in 77 had 15. He had 7 seasons with 10 or more sacks. And my question becomes this. What would Karl Eller be able to do in today's game where you really can't hold?
Okay, what made it okay, it wasn't an official stat until the early 80s because they didn't track it at the time.
Correct.
Presumably, right?
Correct.
And so later on, they clearly started tracking it retroactively. Why can't we then just make it an official stat?
I have no idea. I have no bleeping clue.
Did you guys know that Karl Eller was my first ever interview in this business?
You told this
as an 8-year-old.
Yeah, and you ripped him.
That's right. As an 8-year-old, my dad had some sort of a connection to Karl through a coworker, and I had a class project where you're supposed to interview someone. I don't remember what the context was. And so Karl agreed to let 8-year-old Phil Mackey sit down on camera and do like a 10-question interview.
Yeah. And so softball?
Before the
softball and Phil?
Before the cameras were turned on, my dad introduces me, and my dad, actually, we got lunch earlier in the day at the old Hubert's across from US Bank Stadium. And my dad introduces me to Karl Eller and says, Philip, this gentleman played in 4 Super Bowls with the Minnesota Vikings. And I said, and he lost them all. Trying to show off my knowledge of like, oh, yeah, he lost them all. Wasn't trying to take a cheap shot.
You should have walked out.
Least surprising thing I've ever heard.
He should have walked out. But anyway, put him in today's game where it's not that you don't have teams hold, but I'm willing to bet in the 60s and 70s into the 80s, they held a hell of a lot more.
The jerseys were also baggy, right? Like those guys had baggy jerseys and stuff.
Yes.
All right.
Okay, so Jared Allen is 10, Warren Moon is 8, Karl Eller is 7. Number 6 is a guy who had a fantastic career with the Vikings, but the position has definitely changed. And now with the way that this guy played, he would have definitely been a hybrid tight end wide receiver. It's Steve Jordan.
All right, I like it.
He's 3rd on the Vikings all-time receiving list as it is with 498 catches, okay? 28 touchdowns. In today's game, that guy would put up ridiculous stats.
Yeah, he would have been featured more. He would have been, I don't know if he would have been Tony Gonzalez, but like he would have been.
He would have been like Tony Gonzalez.
Like a Travis Kelce kind of a threat, yeah.
Exactly right. All right, now it's time for, not surprisingly, the run of running backs. And I'm going to start with a guy, Declan's probably too young to recall. Phil, I'm guessing that you do recall this player, though. Running back who came from the San Francisco 49ers, not Roger Craig, though. Amp Lee.
Yes.
170 catches for 1,348 yards, 5 touchdowns. He played for the Vikings from 94 to 96, okay?
Yeah.
He then goes to the St. Louis Rams, and in back-to-back years, in 97, 98, I believe, catches 61 and 64 passes. If you're putting up statistics like that in the 90s, I'm guessing that in today's game, you're probably catching more passes and seen as more because of your versatility and ability to be a receiver, seen as more of a weapon. Amp Lee is on my list.
Yep, I'm with you on Amp Lee. The Vikings had a number of those guys in the 90s and early 2000s.
I'm going to go through a
Swiss Army knife running back guy. Yeah.
So that's 6.
Okay.
All right. Number 5 predates both Phil and Declan, but he's in the Amp Lee mold, but I actually believe he was better. Ricky Young. He had from 78 to 83, 292 receptions, which is still 13th on the all-time Vikings list, by the way, and 14 touchdowns. But so the Vikings essentially employed a version of the West Coast offense before it was called that. Mm-hmm. And Young was not a great running back, but much like Amp Lee, he was versatile. Ricky Young in today's game, I think he wouldn't be dominant, but he'd be very, very good. And he was good back then, but the thought processes back from 78 to 83 were nowhere what they are now.
Who was the first running back? Maybe it was Roger Craig with the Niners in the 80s that was like, all right, we're just going to use this guy. He's going to be used as a wide receiver. He's going to catch 80 to 100 passes. Roger Craig was the first one I remember.
It might be.
Actually, well, keep going on your list.
Okay.
There's a couple other Vikings here that.
Okay.
Roger Craig was a Viking, I believe.
Roger Craig was
for a minute
a Viking. Mm-hmm. All right. We are now to, if I'm not mistaken on my list, we are now to number 4. Yes. Mm-hmm. Number 4 is the reason why I thought of this list. All right. And I got a tweet that said, because I threw this guy's name out on Twitter when I put the tweet out on Tuesday or on Wednesday. And I got one tweet saying, absolutely, you're right. And one tweet saying, he wasn't that good. What are you talking about? But I think he'd be a massive threat in today's game. David Palmer.
So he was mostly a kick and punt returner.
Exactly right. So he played 7 seasons as a Viking in the 90s. Mm-hmm. He had 73 catches total in that time. He also carried the ball as a running back in that time, only 34 times for a paltry 125 yards, 84 career games, 2 touchdowns total offensively. He did have 3 touchdowns in what you're talking about, his kick and punt return duties. But the Vikings at times had the right idea with Palmer. The league just wasn't there yet. Yeah. To the point of, if you go to Pro Football Reference now, there is a year towards the end of his time think it's his penultimate year with the Vikings, in which he is listed on Pro Football's statistical chart for him as a running back wide receiver.
Yeah.
I think David Palmer, and it's not the Vikings' fault, but I think David Palmer, if you brought him back now in his prime, you would say, holy cow, can we do a lot with this guy?
Yeah, he would have been, I don't know if he would have been a superstar, because I think if he was a superstar, they would have found a way to use him more offensively.
I'm with you on that.
But I keep going back to Swiss Army knife ninja offensive players, like guys who are, you can line them up in the slot, you can line them up in the backfield, you can throw passes to them, etc. They can come in on third down.
I think he was a breakaway threat too, or could have been. Not all the time, but if you put David Palmer as a college prospect right now, and he was going to be drafted, I think a team would find ways to use him far more consistently, probably, than was the case back then.
All right, into your top 3 here.
Top 3. Drafted in 2009 and actually used in multiple roles. But I think if he came out of Florida right now and stepped onto the field, 2009 would have been a sampling, especially if his career had gone differently. But Percy Harvin.
Yeah.
Percy Harvin.
Well, he wants to play.
But
trying to get back.
Can you imagine Percy Harvin right now
10 years
stepping into the league?
Honestly, I can,
as a young man.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
no, but I'm saying that player with that talent.
Absolutely.
And I think if Percy Harvin right now is 21, 22 coming out of college, and you plug him in and you are a smart offensive coordinator, I think we're talking about lined up in the backfield all the time, slot receiver.
I think
nightmare.
The Vikings kind of viewed him, and he was a little bit of a trinket player there in 2009, 2010, but they mostly viewed him as a wide receiver. He was just like, you're going to go run some routes, and Brett Favre's going to find you, and whatever. And I it would be fun to see him with like a Kyle Shanahan or a Sean McVay type mind and see what happens. And maybe one of those guys will pick up 31.
Yeah, but it's 31. The horse is out of the barn by that point, right?
I've got 2 guys on my list you have not gotten to yet. I'm wondering if they're 1 and 2 or if we're going to.
Okay. Number 2 on my list, and I have to thank Twitter for this one because this slightly predates me and predates you guys by a lot. But I'm told that if you plug this guy in his prime into today's game, it would be a different world for him. And he was already damn good. Chuck Foreman.
He's one of them on my list. Yes.
He could catch.
Chuck Foreman had 3 consecutive 1,000-yard rushing seasons and had a year where he led the NFL with 73 catches in 1975.
Yes.
And that was, that's like early, I guess you could say, was it early West Coast principles for the Vikings? Were they running sort of a West Coast hybrid?
Burnsy was here by then, yeah. That's probably right. Yep.
So they were into the short passing game and using running backs as receivers, but to see a guy like him, clearly one of the most gifted players in the NFL at that time, to see him with a fully functioning 2020 offense would have been really interesting. And Chuck, first round pick, he's a blue chip talent.
Oh, great player, yeah.
Yep.
And Chuck, to this day, he is the third leading rusher in franchise history behind Adrian Peterson and Robert Smith, and he's 11th all time in receptions.
Yeah.
So, and that goes back to a guy who played here from 73 to 79. So, Chuck Foreman is number 2. Percy Harvin is number 3. My number 1, and I know this guy was great, Hall of Fame player, but with the rules morphed the way they are to favor quarterbacks and receivers, it's Randy Moss.
Wow.
Randy Moss can you imagine him? Can take 1998 Moss, plug him into today's game where they will throw a flag if you are a cornerback who sneezes on a guy. Randy Moss, if you go back and watch, made some unbelievable catches in the face of basically being held or grabbed, right?
Yeah.
That's no longer allowed. So can you imagine the amount of contact, illegal contact that Moss had to work through that now gets called automatically, or guys don't even try? So Randy Moss, just based on the way the game has gone to me, is the league said, how do we get more Randy Mosses? Okay, we enforce the rules like this, but take that player and put him in today's game, and 98 was fantastic. But I think statistically,
interesting. He would not have popped up top of mind in this discussion just because, what do you mean? We already saw him be amazing.
I struggled with it only because of that.
But have this in your mind, okay? So Randy Moss caught 69 passes for 1,300 yards and 17 touchdowns in his rookie season.
Yep.
So 1,300 yards and just ran a rough shot over the NFL. All right. So Randall Cunningham and Brad Johnson were the starting quarterbacks for the Vikings. They combined in that season for around 475 pass attempts. And when we think back to 98, we think, boy, they aired it out. Like every play was a bomb to Moss.
Yep.
And not only was it a pretty balanced offense, but teams just weren't playing with the same tempo. They weren't running no huddle as often. Like they weren't throwing the ball as often in 1998. 475 pass attempts would have ranked 22nd or 23rd in the NFL last year. So imagine the top quarterbacks in terms of attempts last season. Goff, Matt Ryan, Tom Brady were all throwing over 600 passes. Imagine if you would have tacked on an extra 100 pass attempts, like a 2020 offense with 100 more pass attempts, and Randy Moss running around back there. Does he catch an extra like 20 or 30 passes? Does he go for 100 receptions?
An extra 5 to 8 touchdown passes?
So he's averaging 20 yards a reception. Let's say he catches 30 extra passes. He goes for like 18 or 1900 yards in his rookie season at that rate. If you throw the ball more.
I'll give you one thing that we probably don't even think about, and I don't even know if it's tracked or if it was tracked back then. It probably is tracked now. But if you could find the amount of penalty flags drawn by Moss that year, you would probably double it now. So if you took the 98 flags drawn by Moss and used that currency into 2020, my guess is it's double the flags, which is more first downs, which is more. So I struggled with Moss on this list because, as you said, he was already such a great player. But the fact that he changed the game and got people that make the rules to rethink the game make me wonder if that guy had stepped in as a young man this coming year, for instance, what the hell statistically he could have or would have done.
It's amazing. By the way, it was about 500 pass attempts, but still, like they were 100 pass attempts short of what the top passing offenses are throwing in 2019. So that's the list. The only other name I would throw on there that you didn't is actually I've got two of them. Yep. Cordarrelle Patterson coming in the league 7 or 8 years later with a different offensive mind. You know, would he have been used a little bit differently?
Yeah.
And then just for the hilarity, Leroy Horde. I'd like to see Leroy Horde in today's NFL. Just 3 yards up the middle. Just go find a spot between the guard and the center. Lay down.
I'd also add Robert Smith to that list. I'm shocked that they didn't make it in your list.
I thought about it. Yeah, that's a good one because he could definitely catch.
Yeah, and he retired early, so
but was he not used? I felt like the Vikings offensively used him pretty well, and I don't know that there was a lot more there. The Moss thing is only because of how the rules changed. Not that the Vikings didn't use him right. The Vikings used Moss absolutely right, but now with the advantage that the rules would give him, I think it'd be crazy.
Yeah. So that's the pecking order, Judge Zolgad's pecking order of the ex-Vikings he'd like to see in their prime in 2020 in a Vikings uniform. Thank you guys for hanging out with us on Purple Daily. You can find us in podcast form, Apple, Spotify, and scorenorth.com. And a 5-star rating helps us spread the word about this show as we keep pushing the mission of Score North forward, entertain you Minnesota sports fans on a daily basis. On our YouTube channel, click the subscribe button, please. You can help us, build an audience and spread the word, but we can help you by giving you daily Vikings content in your YouTube feed.